I'm Brian Epstein. I'm here with my colleague, Mike Ryall, and today we're going to be talking about broadening formal models of individual and collective intentionality. Some starting points of our project are that we're both interested in thinking about organizational agency. Mike, largely from a game theoretic perspective, me from a social ontology perspective, and we're working together to try to make progress in an interdisciplinary way on these issues. We both think that it's useful to think of organizations as agents, as possessing cognitive states, and to thinking seriously about organizational agency. We think that in doing so, it's useful to think analogously to individual agents. We don't want to force organizational agency to operate just like individual agency, but the structures of organizational cognition we expect are going to look similar to individual cognition in at least certain ways. But we do think that the literature needs more clarity, in particular on the functional roles of certain aspects of cognition, both organizational and individual cognition, and in particular of intention. There's a lot of work in shared intentionality that's built on a certain kind of intuitive requirement that we have to have shared intentions, requiredness for intentions to be shared for groups or organizations, and a little bit less of an emphasis on the particular functional roles that shared intention plays in the cognitive life of an organization. And we think that this is something that needs to be worked on. At the same time, we also both agree that it's important to construct bridges between organizational cognition and the components of organizations. Instead of thinking of organizations like firms and households just as primitive agents, we think that it's important to account for organizational cognition in terms of individuals and structures and the environment that may be constitutive of those organizations. We don't think that it's necessary to reduce organizational cognition to, say, individual cognition, but we do think that some sorts of bridges are going to be required to make sense of it. Now, in this area, of course, there's a tremendous amount of literature in the work that's being done by people at this conference. There's a tremendous amount of work on intention in action theory, lots of work, for instance, starting with Bratman's 1987 work on planning agency. There's a lot of ideas about what the roles of intention are in the cognitive lives of bounded agents, certain kinds of functions that intentions might play. And a lot of that is applied to organizations as well. There's also some formal work that a lot of formal work actually that's been driven by this pioneering work in action theory. The so-called BDI, or belief, desire, intention models, are one kind of formalization. There are lots of other related models. These are formalizations of cognitive systems that involve intentions. In computer science, people work on BDI agents and multi-agent systems. And then in modal logic and other like epistemic dynamic logics, people work on various kinds of logical formalizations of the role of these kinds of cognitive states. Work on organizational cognition, well, of course, in this context, there's a lot of people working on collective intentionality, both reductive and non-reductive treatments, but there's also a lot of work in other fields as well. People in organizational psychology work on what bounded organizational agents are like. There is recent work, for instance, on the idea of organizational agents intentionally forgetting certain kinds of things as a way to solve certain kinds of bounds. That's a work in organizational cognition. And then there's also a big literature on institutions as kind of constraining and enabling various kinds of practical activity of organizational agents. And then there's an enormous literature in game theory where game theorists address boundedness of agents. There are lots of approaches that they take to boundedness, including limitations to the aspects of what part of the game is known to an agent, modeling uncertainty, introducing different types of agents and epistemic limitations of agents. Recently, there's also some very interesting work in unawareness in game theory, which we're going to be drawing on. And also in connection with intention, there is some work on commitment. And the questions of commitment are very important in game theory. And game theorists have largely introduced external commitment devices in order to bind agents in various ways. So all of these are ways of thinking about different kinds of literatures that introduce twists on how cognition works for bounded agents that's going to be pertinent to formalizing and clarifying some of the functional roles of commitment and of intention. Now, the key issue that we are confronting is that the informal models, particularly in the theory of action, we think suggest but don't really demonstrate some of the functional roles that these cognitive states play. What exactly, very precisely, are the functional roles of the cognitive states like commitment and intention for cognizers? How precisely do these states contribute to outcomes? And why can't we just use a model that don't include these? Why can't we use a more parsimonious model of cognizers? Now, we agree, contra the parsimonious approach to cognition, that if you have a cognizer who's bounded and doesn't have commitments, then that leads to deficient outcomes. So we agree with the insight that commitment and intention is playing a very important functional role, but we disagree that the informal models really prove that point or show how the outcomes are deficient. We agree with these intuitive views of commitment and intention, but adding these particular cognitive states in some ways seems ad hoc or at least imprecise. And it's particularly so in regard to explaining when it is that commitments get made, when and how they get made, and even more so, under what conditions commitments get abandoned. What triggers or determines the fact that we give up on a plan and go back and recalculate and try to replan? This is something that we think needs a lot more attention and formalization. And we think that there's an opportunity to develop this more fundamental explanation. So the project that we're pursuing is at the intersection of game theory and the theory of action. And what we're really doing is dividing it into two steps. One is to think about enhancing models of individual agency. And what we're trying to do is to take existing models of individual agency, but then kind of rethink them in order to account for cognitive features that are not treated in belief desire models. And so we're going to try to model the need and roles for things like commitment for individual agents. And once we've done that, then we're going to develop models of organizational agents using appropriate analogies to and disanalogies from the individual case. Our idea is really to try to develop a more fundamental understanding of commitment and thereby of key features of intention. We want to try to explain how we get these mechanisms of internal commitment, how internal commitments get formed, show why commitment is needed in rational agents, and then importantly, show how we can derive features of commitment and planning from those processes and mechanisms, and interestingly, hopefully show what triggers the rational abandonment of a plan. Okay, with that, I'll pass it on to Mike.
Great, thank you, Brian. So what I'm going to do is just go through a very, very simple problem that illustrates a little bit of our framework in sort of a graphical way, and we'll illustrate one of the issues that sort of pops out immediately once you start thinking about these things very carefully and sort of taking the dynamics of the thing seriously. So imagine that there's a toddler in a living room at the beginning of time. So Brian has a couple of young kids. So this example sort of popped out while we were discussing about these things. And in front of the toddler are two toys. We'll just label them A and B. There are various things going on in the room. The toddler's preferences are such that the toddler would like to get the best toy. Between A and B is uncertain about which one that is, but takes as a informational signal of which toy is best, whether or not the toy is ringing a bell or playing a tune. The toddler's preferences are the toddler would like to have the best toy, but would rather have a toy, would rather have the second best toy than have no toy at all, right? So these are the toddler's preferences. So this is just very, very simple, very stripped down. And let's have a look at how we're thinking about that in a formal way. So moving on to the next slide. I'm going to take a little bit of time explaining what's going on in this slide so that you can see sort of what the problem is that we run into when the agent is rational, does not really have any capacity constraints other than having to think in time. Okay, so what we see at the very top, so they're going to be, t equals 0 is the beginning of time, and time periods going into the future. At t equals 0, if we just focus on this for a second, in the top area in the black bubbles are nature's state spaces. So this is a S0n is a snapshot of the world at a particular moment in time. And the state space describes not only what's happening. So in this case, what we're showing as the thing that is actually happening at that moment is A star. So that's why that's bolded. A, the first place, says the toy that is making noise is A, and the best toy is the A star. Now, what could be happening in this world, what could also have been true, is that B was the best toy and A nevertheless was ringing, or that A was the best toy and B was ringing, or that B was the best toy and B was ringing. There's sort of four things that could be true, but what is true at this moment is that A is the best toy and A is ringing. Now, within the way that we treat state space is that within the state space is also a description of the agent's cognitional states as well. So the agent's cognitional states are part of the world that's being described in the state space. And so we see what we've illustrated here is this SI0 is the subjective state space of agent I, of the toddler. And so what this says is this is the blue bubble below. It says that in the state A star, it is also the case that the toddler is uncertain about the toddler is certain that A is making noise, but is uncertain about which toy is best, and that's shown with the dash line. And then there are other things that the toddler could be reasoning about. So the toddler knows that A is ringing, believes that A is probably the best, but isn't sure, and then can reason about, well, I could also have been in a world in which B was ringing, and so forth. And then these green lines coming out are also the way that the agent is thinking about the future. And so the agent is now going to sort of sequence in their own mind in state 0, has a notion of what's going to happen in this future and has beliefs about what's going to happen in the future. So that's the green line leading off there, and we could elaborate that into all of the steps that the agent is thinking about. So, but what happens here is the basic thing that happens. The toddler finds herself in state 0, says, okay, there are two toys in front of me. I need to get the best toy. So the first step is to sort of think about what problem am I going to solve? I'm going to solve the get the best toy problem. And so as that decision is being made, the toddler moves into the next step, right? So the toddler hasn't acted yet. The toddler is thinking. And thinking about what to do. So what we're going to think about what to do is to get the best toy. But in that interval, nature acts, and so nature's act is to start B ringing. And so we've transitioned from the state where A is the best toy and A is ringing to the new state where A is the best toy and B is ringing. Now, the toddler, being a rational agent, realizes, okay, the ringing is an indication of which toy is best. It's a signal. And so now the toddler shifts to believing that, well, I guess maybe I should update my beliefs and believe that I need to go after B. And at that point, an intention happens. And the toddler now forms an intention, which will trigger the next step, which is a planning step, which will then trigger action. So there's sort of a sequence of cognitional steps in our model that have to happen in sequence before action can happen. And the fact that they're happening in time means that things can get inside that decision loop and that change the state of the world and may change the way that the rational decision maker is thinking about the world. So already what's happened is that there's been some new the other toy is now making noise. The intention is to get B. This is the outcome that I want to attain. I believe B is best, is what's happening in period t equals 1. And the intention is formed to get B. But in moving to the planning stage, nature acts again within that decision loop and moves back to A ringing. Now we've got a problem because the rational decision maker, says, okay, there's information content in which toy is ringing. I now have to go back to forming an intention. I had the wrong intention. I was intending to get B, but now A is ringing. I need to update my beliefs, and I now believe that A is actually the best thing, and I need to change my intention. Well, you can see one of the problems that could occur in this world is that the intention, the information is coming in, is contradictory, and it's causing basically what we would refer to as paralysis by analysis, right? I start to form an intention. I haven't acted yet. Oh, but now there's some new information. It's rational for the decision maker to be responding to informative information. We've assumed that this is representing a situation in which information is coming that has information content, and the rational decision maker who is unconstrained in being able to think about things and analyze things. The only constraint is that there is some steps in time between thinking about the problem, intending what to do, planning, and then actually taking action. That's sort of the boundedness that we're talking about here. And obviously, the rational decision maker doesn't like being in this situation and realizes that I could be doing this forever and I won't get anything. The outcome of this will be get nothing, right? Which is the worst possible outcome. So what would be really nice and would be really clearly helpful to the decision maker is some way of attaching a commitment to the intention. But how does that actually work, right? What is actually happening here? How would we represent that mathematically? So we can do that. We can look at that on the next slide and show how we're thinking about it. So the way that we're thinking about it is to bring in unawareness. I'm going to skip right to t equals 2. So what we're looking at is a shift, that the intention changes the cognitive state of the decision maker, so that the decision maker now focuses on, you can think of focus as sort of the mirror image of unawareness. The decision maker now says, I'm going to get B. I believe, that B is the best. I've decided that B is the best, and I'm committing to B is the best. And I become focused and unaware of, I'm not going to pay attention to other things and other information that comes into my field of awareness, right? I'm not going to allow them to enter my field of awareness. And so what happens in T2 is that the intention changes the subjective space and the things that the decision maker can reason about or will reason about, the information that the decision maker will pay attention to. So basically what's happening now, and if you were to have any of those other states occur in t equals 2, they would all point to the same, they would all sort of contain the same cognitional structure for the decision maker, which is B is the best, I'm going to get B. Now, I just want to mention from a technical point of view, this solves a number of technical problems. So it is not helpful, and the sort of commitment cannot be made sensible by doing something like putting zero probability on a large state space. So it isn't enough for the decision maker to have the same sort of all the states elaborated that nature has and then start putting different probabilities on it. It's actually the case that the state space has to represent what the decision maker is aware of. Game theory uses this in cases of innovation. So we like to think about innovation and the point that has been made in the past by some very famous thinkers, that most innovation is not about discovery and patenting. So you might think of, I discover something, it becomes presented to me, then I patent it and no one else can use it. And there are inventions like that. But most inventions are things like Cirque du Soleil. Cirque du Soleil was a new business that was created by taking existing things like acrobats and rock concerts and lighting and staging and combining them in a new way that no one else was thinking about, that no one else had any idea about. It wasn't that they were putting zero probability on it as not possible, is that it wasn't even in their minds. And so this is an area of sort of, there's a technical question of, well, how do you represent that? And this is, in a very simplified way, how you can go about representing that. What's innovative about what we're saying is, well, it also seems to be the case that this can be intended, that you can have focus, that you can decide to intentionally make yourself unaware, to have this internal commitment device that makes you unaware of this incoming information. You get to decide what you're going to be aware of. And you can see that in this case, once that happens, the plan goes through. The decision maker says, okay, I'm now intending to get B. My focus is on B is the best, I'm going to get B. And now the rest follows. I can now make a plan, I can implement the plan, I will get B. Notice that in this world, that's actually second best, right? So the way we've set that up is the intention is formed at a moment that makes that second best, but it's better than being in a world where you just sit there thinking about the thing and getting bounced around by information coming every which way. We think this is a real thing. We think this is a real thing that happens at the individual level. As the reason this came up was Brian's toddler and just going, I'm now going to get B, and nothing's going to dissuade me from that. But this also seems to have some purchase at the organizational level. In fact, there are people that talk about avoiding paralysis by analysis, what you focus on, what the plan is, and so on. So we think that this is something that's going to scale up.
Let me add one more thing, and that is that I just wanted to highlight something that Mike said earlier, which was that this is not a feature of the boundedness of the calculational capacities of the toddler, though she does have capacity limits. It's a feature of the fact simply that the plan unfolds over time. And so in thinking about diagnosing what's going on in terms of the role of commitment in addressing bounded agents, this is a very different kind of diagnosis than the standard intuitive diagnosis that, well, it's really hard to think everything through or think through all the options, so we're going to focus on one thing. This is instead a kind of role of commitment, a very kind of precise role of commitment that arises even with a kind of cognitively unbounded agent who simply happens to be acting through time.
So good. So let's just end it there, basically. So what we're saying is look, you need to think a little bit about this idea of internal commitment. So it does seem important. So clearly, just sort of sitting there thinking about things is a problem, because in real life you care about doing things and achieving things. So this is showing one way that unawareness or intentional unawareness or focus is a way of committing yourself internally. This is important. So Brian had said earlier that in game theory, we think a lot about commitment and what makes commitments credible. And we talk about, in game theory, a lot about credible threats, right? So if you've got an entrant who wants to, who looks like they're about to enter the market, the incumbent might make a threat of, well, look, if you enter the market, I'm going to cut my prices and drive you out of business. That's what I'm going to do. But what makes that credible, right? So it's not credible if cutting my prices to drive you out of business also drives me out of business. So that's not a credible threat. But if I invest in lowering my costs, or if I invest in doubling my capacity, so I've got a bunch of unused capacity so that when you come in, I can flood the market or something, now the threat's credible, because all of a sudden it is rational for me to do what I'm threatening to do. And so the question comes up of, well, how do I do that internally? Because it seems very easy to change your plans. Now, if you're a large corporation and you've got some large planning process, or even if I'm an individual and there's some intricate thing that I'm planning, like how to get my college degree, and I've thought about all this stuff, then there are some costs to changing the plan. But even in these simple situations, like going for A or B that happen very quickly, I need some sort of commitment device. I need to be able to credibly commit to what I'm going to do, even though other information may be coming in that's going to bounce me around and maybe cause me to keep changing my plans and updating my plans. So we think that this intentional unawareness is sort of an internally credible commitment device that someone can use. Now, this raises some interesting questions. For example, once I've done this, what is it that allows me? I don't want to do this at all costs. So if I'm going for toy A and someone starts yelling fire, fire, it's time to abandon going after toy A and get out of the building, right? So, but how do we think about that? And we think that we've got a nice mathematical foundation to answer that question, or at least provide some answers to that question. And then that, as a game theorist, leads to an interesting question, which is, well, how do these things work when we're interacting with other agents? Because it's an internal commitment, does that make it not credible? Or is there some way? What is it that what does this mechanism do for me when I'm interacting with others who really do not have the capacity to read my mind? And so maybe I write a contract. Maybe I do need to have some way of creating an external commitment device. But what's going on internally? And we think that pivoting to organizations, that's going to be very important, because although you would think, well, this is sort of a very weak form of commitment, at least where I'm interacting with other people. When I'm getting into a group, typically that's in order to do something that the group wants to do. We are cooperating with each other. And so it may make a lot of sense in that case to, these weaker forms of commitment, or signaling them in some way, or being able to agree to certain, awareness commitments or certain foci are going to be helpful, particularly helpful in that setting. So we think there's a lot of work to be done, but we think that the work that we are doing seems promising. It's fleshed out some interesting points already, and we think it's going to be scalable into the group setting.
Thanks. Yeah, we look forward to hearing any comments and questions you guys have. Thanks, everybody.